the conference Plenary, a Liberatory Potential, which is a celebration of war baby love child and the visions of mixed race Asian American art. Let's begin with a celebratory applause. My name is Anna Storti, and I'm the Andrew W. Mellon Assistant Professor of Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies at Duke University. And I'm also the lucky one who gets to facilitate a conversation with these three visionaries, Kina, Ming, Dariotis, and Gina Osterloh. In 2013, Kina and Ming Dariotis published War Baby Love Child, Mixed Race Asian American Art with the University of Washington Press. The book pairs artwork with interviews with 19 mixed race and mixed heritage Asian American artists, touching upon U.S. wars in Asia, transnational adoption, settler colonialism in Hawaii, indigeneity, Blackness, and brownness. War Baby Love Child brings together first-person perspectives in a wider scholarly context, shedding light on changing Asian American cultures. In 2013, the year of the book's publication, the world looked a lot different. Obama was president. Gay marriage hadn't yet been legalized on a federal level. Abortion was a constitutional right. Bombs were set off at the Boston Marathon, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership was still under negotiation. This was pre-Brexit, pre-Trump, and of course, America was entrenched in neoliberal multiculturalism, where, at least for many of us, it was standard to critique the liberal guise of the US war machine. In that vein, one could say that over the past decade, not much has changed at all. 10 years ago, in the summer of 2014, Israel launched an air and ground attack on Gaza that killed more than 2,000 Palestinians. Elliot Rodger carried out his spree killings in Isla Vista, California, and a police officer shot and killed 18-year-old Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. Deadly typhoons, floods, wildfires, and earthquakes became more commonplace around the world. Like then, today, the police state killing, Israel continues a genocidal campaign, imperialism and global war continue to leave devastating and lasting impacts, resulting in intergenerational trauma and the assault on our future life, to the rise in fascism and the military's culpability and environmental disaster. At a moment when diversity, equity, and inclusion is not simply under threat, but in the midst of being extinguished, how are we to reckon with the claims laid out in such popular publications as National Geographic, who, again, in 2013, projected that by 2050, average American will be mixed race? You may think that the world is better now. You may think that things have worsened, perhaps a little bit of both. But what remains consistent about then and now, in my eyes, is that we still have artists who guide us to remember the past and to imagine new and more nourishing tomorrows. To counter the violence, we have coalition and mass mobilization. We have the promise of minoritarian aesthetics and transformative justice. The work we're gathering this morning to celebrate in this plenary speaks towards these insurgent desires, and thus to a radical potential of critical mixed race studies, where practices like abolition and decolonization are as much a mixed race issue as identity, representation, and belonging. It is true that there are growing numbers of mixed race people and families in the world nowadays. What would it mean to channel that growth towards a liberatory potential? As modeled by War Baby Love Child, its editors and artists, the nexus point where critical mixed race studies and contemporary art meet is an incredibly rich one. It is at this juncture where one can source answers for political and ethical dilemmas surrounding reproductive justice and queer trans politics, to media representation, AI, anti-colonial, and anti-imperial. It is also here where much can be gleaned about the methods in which we pursue our work and our relationships with one another. So I'll now introduce our panelists before I turn over the mic to them for some introductory remarks. After they speak, I'll pose a few questions that I have prepared, but then I really want to leave most of the space for audience Q&A. I encourage everyone, both online or in the room, to at any point you have a question develop or percolate, feel free to just enter that into the Q&A chat on the app. We will do our best to project people, but do let us know if things become not too accessible. Kina is a queer mixed-race Okinawan American artist and Vincent DePaul professor at the art school at DePaul University in Chicago. Kina co-edited War Baby Love Child and Queering Contemporary Asian American Art and illustrated Lee A. Tonouchi's children's book, Okinawan Princess. He's a curator for the virtual Asian American Art Museum and the series editor for critical ethnic studies and visual culture with the University of Washington Press. In 2023, they were awarded Outstanding Commitment in Education by the State of Illinois Treasurer's Office for LGBTQ+ History Month and the Provost Award for Excellence in Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at DePaul University. Along with Camila Fojas and Ming Dariotis, she co-founded the Critical Mixed Race Studies Conference, which I believe we're here. And she worked with G. Reginald Daniels to publish the inaugural CMRS journal. Dr. Ming Dariotis served as the inaugural Assistant Vice President of the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion at the University of Maryland, Baltimore, prior to which at San Francisco State University, she was Professor Emerita of Asian American Studies, affiliate faculty of the Educational Leadership Doctoral Program, and faculty director of the Center for Equity and Excellence in Teaching and Learning. Dr. Dariotis is now managing partner and co-founder of Ming and Dariotis, a strategic values alignment consulting firm. She is co-editor of Fight the Tower, Asian American Women Scholars, Resistance and Renewal in the Academy, published by Rutgers in 2020, and War Baby, Love Child. With Laura Kina and Camila Fojas, Dr. Dariotis is also the founder of Critical Mixed Race Studies Conference and the co-designer of the field of CMRS. She also co-founded the Journal of Critical Mixed Race Studies and is a founding director of the editorial board of Asian American Literature, Discourses. Gina Osterloh is an artist and associate professor of art at the Ohio State University. Photography is the conceptual ground for Osterloh's interdisciplinary art. Her photography, video, performance art, and steel sculpture activate photographic conditions, including replica, representation, flatness and volume, presence and absence, illusion and the real, desire and repulsion. Photo tableau is central to her work, a dynamic place to hold the complexities of growing up mixed race Filipino German American in Ohio. Questions of perception and how a viewer perceives difference. A 2024 Guggenheim Fellow, her solo exhibitions and performances have appeared at the Columbus Museum of Art, MoCA Detroit, Higher Pictures Generation in New York, Silver Lens in Manila, Philippines, the Broad Museum in LA, and Yerba Buena Center for the Arts in San Francisco. Her group exhibitions have appeared at the International Center of Photography Museum in New York, Ateneo University in Quezon City, Philippines, and Arizona State University Art Museum. So please again, join me in giving a warm welcome. So I thought we'd begin with Laura and Wei Ming. To me, and I think to most of us, War Baby, Love Child is so clearly crafted with care and intention. It is indeed a book about cultural workers in mixed race America, but there is so much more to say about its activist origins. It being born from two queer people of color. It is also grounded in relationships with artists and a convergence of the community arts movement and critical mixed race studies. So I'd like to begin by asking you both to speak towards the origin story of the book and of your collaboration. How did you meet? How did this become possible?
We want to make sure, can you hear us in the back there? Yes? Okay, wonderful. Ming, you want to talk about how we met? I thought you were going to start. Okay, so we really wanted to ground our origin stories in our friendship. And even kind of before that, Laura and I both have a background in community arts organizing. I was involved with Kearney Street Workshop, which is the oldest interdisciplinary pan-ethnic Asian American arts organization in the country, which was at the Center for the Development of the Asian American Movement in San Francisco in Chinatown. And in 1999, I was part of the team that co-founded Aperture, a window on the art of Asian Pacific Americans, which is where Ali Wong first stepped on stage. So you're welcome. I was also involved with the Asian American Women Artists Association, not so much as I'm a hobby artist. So for me, it was more about the arts organizing and being part of a larger Asian American community. At the same time, I was also very involved in HAPA Issues Forum. I was on the board. I co-founded the San Francisco chapter of that organization. And just so you're clear, I then later disavowed the use of the word HAPA by non-Native Hawaiians. Around was it 2003 or something around there?
It was a while ago.
Right, I organized a conference in partnership with Hapa Issues Forum at San Francisco State. It was the last HIF conference. But it was a 3-day conference, and Kip Fulbeck came there and started his Hapa 100% Art Asian 100% Hapa or Hapa project photography in a back room that he set up in the back of the conference. So like a third of the people in that book, including Laura and me, were attendees at that conference, and a lot of them were my students and friends and whatnot. So I don't actually think we met then.
You were using my artwork in your
I
teaching.
was
I was using your articles in my teaching. So we had a sort of long distance relationship.
Yeah.
I'm based in Chicago. Yeah, and it wasn't until 2008 when we met, and we were at a leadership retreat at, you said it was a former cult or something, but it was a retreat outside of San Francisco. And this, I was at that time involved with Maven Foundation. So I came there with Louis Gong and Amanda Erickson, and you were there with.
I was there with iPride because we had been running a summer camp program for mixed race and transracially adopted youth called Fusion. So we had folks from iPride, Eric Kamako and I were there from Hapa Issues Forum. It was Eric and Ellie Nagai Roth who brought together this group of 17 what they called multiracial leaders to do this 3-day retreat. And we spent a lot of time visioning and imagining what could be. Laura and I planned on purpose to meet there for the first time in person.
Along with Camilla.
Along with Camilla Fojas, who Laura brought as her colleague from DePaul. But we had been talking on the phone with each other, writing each other emails, and just generally corresponding because I had loved her Hapa soap opera series. If you haven't seen it, please look it up. It's a wonderful series of paintings featuring mixed heritage, Asian American artists, writers, people in your community, your brother, folks like that. And it just spoke to me about this, like this mythical bringing together into community space. And it was really that series that inspired the project. So we spent this weekend brainstorming, and that's the weekend where CMRS was born also.
And at the time they said, oh, we're going to do open source. I think they said open source technology, something like this. Basically, it was just putting Post-it notes on one of these visioning boards, those kind of conference retreat activities. And they said, where do you see yourselves in 5 years, 10 years, and that kind of thing, at getting groups, that kind of business. So out of that, I think we were just sort of flippantly saying, well, we should start a conference, or we should, we didn't say a book originally. We said we were going to curate a show together. So the actual wording on what CMRS was, you wrote that at that moment. And we wrote it together. But you were right. But anyway, we were envisioning things. And then I went back home to Chicago and I approached the DePaul Art Museum and we pitched this idea for a show. And then we started doing studio visits, and somewhere along the line, I'm in LA interviewing Amanda Roscoe in her amazing studio. And I'm like, damn, this is more than just because, I had run an oral history project since 2009, Asian American Art Oral History Project, cataloging artist histories in the Midwest, just sort of focusing on that. In terms of community arts, I'm an MFA trained as a artist, a professional artist, but I've been involved with Asian American artist collectives for 30 years. And in Chicago, we have a group called the Asian American Artists Collective. So I've been really conscious about both putting on huge, events, but then taking the time to archive and catalog our history. So that was my impulse. And being in Asian American arts, I was noticing so many of us were multiracial, and I wanted to focus on that. And just curating a show.
Yeah.
A studio visit after studio visit, I'm like, there's a bigger story to tell here. And as we were, back then, oral history was considered research. So you had to do IRB. So there was a standard set of how all the questions were asked. And so that's why that framework is there. And then we realized this is a bigger thing and we should map on those histories, the context. So you have the first person narrative stories. And we really wanted to make this very accessible. So we purposely made all the chapters short, everything short,
So you can use it in class. Yeah.
Undergrad level.
Yeah.
So even accessibility and language was something we're focused on.
And we actually reached out to specific scholars that we knew who were doing research in the particular intersections like Afro-Asian, Latino Asian, Native Asian, and so forth, so that we could have that scholarly input as well. And we also, a lot of those scholars were doing research on their own identities, right? So it's that very engaged internal reflective scholarship, as well as having this kind of broader historical context. So it's a really unique text. I think the format of it is I don't think anybody else has really done anything quite like it, but we really based what we wanted to, you know, draw in terms of the historical and sociological context from the artwork.
Yeah, that's
Right.
really
It
important,
bubbled
that
up.
it's, the format of this comes from, we're drawn to artworks and how the artworks speak to each other. So it comes from a curatorial premise, right? We're thinking spatially and relationally, and then it's dialogic back and forth. I have been informally mentored by Margot Machida, and she uses oral hermeneutics. So that's both interviewing artists with the intent to have shared interpretation of the work. So in art history, there used to be a thing of like, don't interview artists always lie, you can't trust them. And I'm like, no, right? So I think that was that. Our project comes one out of making a really intervention in art, specifically Asian American art. And both of us are also coming from Asian American studies.
Yeah.
So that's like kind of the origin point, and then mixed race then is something
Well,
in addition.
we really want, and I should say, we were mentored on this project also by Mark Johnson, who was at San Francisco State and who organized a huge exhibit on Asian American art at the DeYoung Museum, and also did a book on 100 years of Asian American art in California. When we thought about this book at the same time that we're developing critical mixed race studies as an academic discipline, we thought our forebears in mixed race studies, we're talking Maria Root and all, you know, these folks, a lot of their, and you know, Paul Spicker, Reg Daniel, Teresa Williams, and Minakshima, a lot of these folks are doing work that is very sociologically based, it's very historical based. We wanted to bring the cultural studies lens into mixed race studies and make sure that there was like kind of open that space. So that, you know, if you're doing mixed race studies, you can do it from any other disciplinary angle or mix of angles and be okay. And that's what this is. It's cultural studies, but it is also critical mixed race studies. So it also has that sociological and historical lens to it.
If we can take you back in time, and I loved your intro that you did. So in the art world, I don't know if any of you remember that moment where we all thought we were post-race. So in 2001, there's an exhibition freestyle at the Studio Museum in Harlem with Thelma Golden and Glenn Ligon. And we're sort of jokingly talking about this idea of post-race. So artists of color were getting just really tired of always having to present themselves as, I'm a Black artist, I'm an Asian artist, and the work was only read through that. And artists were asking for more freedom. And then there was sort of an acknowledgement of a sense of a nostalgia for not having actually lived through the civil rights moment, but that formed who we are. And so this was a conversation. Well, that word post-race, once it left that tiny little white cube of the art world, even if it was a face of color, it did not translate well. So there was a big debate of like, oh, are you anti-Black and so on. And so this was the moment when in the art world that we were still kind of in that shadow of post-race, and it was out of fashion to organize around issues of race. So I met Gina through Sarita's work, and at the same time Suzette Min was writing, and there was that show One Way or Another, Asian American Art Now, which claimed, you know, sort of facetiously to be the last Asian American art show ever. But the idea that this had been sort of exhausted, this mode of inquiry had been exhausted. And so I had a feeling of coming to a party too late, you know, and, you know, I feel like I was just sort of coming into my own as a younger artist at the time.
Really younger than.
And I was thinking, I have so much more I want to say, and why is it over? And
So much to say about identity,
Mhm.
really, right? So that was really one of the foundational questions of the book. I remember Laura asking or saying, my art explores, you know, like this question about identity and mixedness. And I'm wondering if other artists like me are asking the same questions. So that question really became like a foreground of the book. And we interviewed each artist asking the question, how do you relate to these labels for baby, love child? And then we added the happy hapa, right? So that there was this moment, the post-racial moment, not coincidentally coincided with this construction of a happy Hapa image, but very specifically this Eurasian child that you started seeing in all of the ads, who was somehow happily blending their white father and Asian mother always, and therefore solving the race problem.
And fitting into this neoliberal cultural moment. And that is one of the reasons why we wanted to historically ground the analysis of each of the artists' work and looking at different things. And so, we're
And being clear, we were resisting and pushing against that happy Hapa image, right?
Yeah. Do you want to talk about those terms, war baby love child? Because I think growing up, we all of us, have the what are you? We were joking the other day now that we're both middle-aged people or not so far.
Nobody ever asked.
We're
Yeah, which is great. I find it freeing. We used to all the time. I think every day of my life until I hit my mid-30s, I was at least once a day asked, what are you? And it didn't matter what I answered. People always just assumed that I was a war baby because of my generation. So actually, my parents are hippies, and they met at the University of Hawaii at a party on the Lanai. I think they were drunk. There's no other explanation, And so when I would tell people, they'd say, "What are you?" And I'd say, "I'm Chinese, Greek, and Swedish." And they would always say, "Oh, did your parents meet in Vietnam?" And I'm like, "What?"
High school cafeteria. Hey, what are you? Are you white or black? And of course, when you're in high school, you have no idea what's going on. You're just confused and angry. And it wasn't until I encountered mixed race studies that I realized I was caught, interpolated by a very limited binary set of constructs. This photograph, titled Somewhere Tropical, looking back, I want to just first pause on this photograph. It is the very first studio photo tableau I created in grad school at UC Irvine. It wasn't until the photograph was printed and hanging on my studio wall that one night, probably around 2 a.m., I stopped and became freaked out and enthralled by the shape of the head, turning away from the camera, refusing the photographic colonial gaze. This shape, the void, the hole, something vaginal, a blind spot, the wound, the punctum. I was also channeling, wow, we're getting some pretty awesome sound. That is exactly my entire artist statement. Yes, the cat scream. I think that was a cat screaming. An illegally entered cat. Maybe not a cat, just something animalistic. In this work, I was also channeling stories of my mother growing up in the Philippines, living in hiding, trying to escape Japanese soldiers who had burned down her family home, and really just grappling with being in Los Angeles and the incredible landscape of LA, the palm trees that weren't originally there, the ephemeral sunset, and dealing with questions of passing and not passing, assimilation, the impossibility of assimilating, and also refusing to assimilate. Camouflage and the body, the gesture of holding up one's hands, relinquishing any sense of individuality to a larger force field. Again, the shape of interpolation the police hold up. This was the first move towards flattening, purchasing a set of the tropics from eBay. Also thinking about the delineation between civilian and soldier, anonymity. Issues of representation. This is my Venn diagram of representation and images. I love Venn diagrams. Yes, we should all share our Venn diagrams. Please email me. On one side, the actual event or person. The other side, culture, belief systems, ideas. Did we have breakfast or not? Are we hungry? And in the middle, images and representation, photography. In terms of race and gender, real lived experiences responding to the gaze, the camera consciousness in which we all have within us. This is the area in the middle, the area which I am expanding, punching, tearing open. Very quickly, the etymology of the word image includes artificial representation of an object, statue, likeness, mental representation, imitating, to copy. I quickly became aware that the representation of military camouflage is already very familiar with the viewer. And so I wanted to go into the underlying formations of identity, mimesis. I shifted to creating monochrome paper rooms and working intensively with color and pattern and how the figure can embody camouflage, can mimic color, can mimic pattern. And in this case, wanting to vomit and throw up against what representation is. Just to speak non-academically, I was in grad school and I was working with photographs that were maybe located more in what we call real space, although I very much believe that the studio is real space. For example, if I had a corner of a house in my photographs, then classmates would be like, oh, it's about domesticity. And I just got so tired of it. And so in grad school, I started just to cover it all up with a monochrome room. But for me, it was the beginning of creating my own visual language.
Can you reshare your Zoom? We can't see it.
Yes, okay, sure.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
Sorry, people online, we love you. Give us time to think about your questions. You might ask.
Presentation. Just make sure I'm starting with the right slide.
Got it, make sure you got it. But one of my,
I do love a band bag. The logo.
okay, great.
And now we have to thank a former friend of Camille Kohlhaas's for, so.
All right.
Logo.
So again, the blank, an area where the delineation of a body is unexpected or misrecognized. When being asked that question, hey, what are you? I wanted to respond with silence, a blank. Oops. The technical aspects of photography, framing, steadfast focus, clarity, detail, aperture, are very much part of my own photographs in terms of formal strategies. For example, the head of hair, the head being a hole or aperture, thinking about ways in which the body can speak through muteness. What does it look like if the room is curved, no longer has right angles? What does it look like if the body mimics blankness, the void, a temptation by space? The author Roger Caillois, C-A-I-L-L-O-I-S, French social theorist, wrote the book, a collection of essays called The Edge of Surrealism. And in it talks about how when an insect undergoes a threat, it may lose any sense of individuality, therefore allowing the environment to write its visual code on its body, camouflage. In the book Discrepant Abstraction by Kobina Mercer, abstraction is tackled as a cross-cultural formal strategy used outside of the monolithic quest for artistic purity. In fact, abstraction can be quite the opposite. Professor and artist Angeline Morrison wrote in her chapter Autobiography of an X-Colored Surface, Monochrome and Liminality, quote, so if there is nothing to see, what can you find to say? If a blank space is foregrounded, framed, and actively presented as a separate entity in its own right, then historically received notions of meaning are radically destabilized. When a spectator stands before a pictorial surface, they expect some kind of picture. When confronted by a picture that does not depict, a sort of psychic panic often ensues. And so this is a little bit difficult to see on the digital reproduction here. It's me standing behind a blank piece of paper, a hole cut out with my mouth. If you look closer, if you were in a museum, right, if you saw this photograph from 50 feet away, you would see a blank monochrome, a red rectangle with a spot in the middle. Upon closer inspection, you would see lips, teeth, and tongue, and open mouth. In 2007, 2008, I lived in the Philippines, made possible by a Fulbright. And I thought my practice would drastically shift, but it only became more focused. Questions of speaking, not being seen, misrecognized due to the inadequate ability to speak Tagalog fluently, conditions of diaspora. A body that resists fixed gender identity, moving away from the physical body. I started to work with paper mache and further pushed into flatness, the photograph, again, photographic conditions, moving from volume into 2D, also further pushing, exploring camouflage. The silhouette, the tracing of the body. In this series, I was asking, what does it look like if all of our edges are torn and there are no clean edges? I had a residency at a nonprofit space in Los Angeles called Los Angeles Contemporary Exhibitions. And in it, instead of just tracing figures, I started to trace the shadow of visitors who would walk into the gallery, the articulation of space. How do we represent space? How do we recognize and define space? Thinking about single point perspective of the camera. I started to work and think about the actual tracing of the shadow, my shadow, the conflation between real and illusion. What does that look like to have both real and illusion, the physical body and the shadow, both support and oppose each other, and at times perhaps be rendered indiscernible? I'm going to play a little bit of the, this is a video, but it's actually a 16mm film. No sound, except if you were in the museum, you would hear the clicking of the 16mm projector. And the total length of the projection is 5 minutes and 29 seconds, but I'll speak a little bit over it. So going back to around 35 AD, Pliny the Elder was gathering oral stories around the area that we know today to be Egypt and Greece, and was writing about a story that was being told about a young woman's lover about to leave forever. It is assumed for war, and she projects in the story. It says she and his shadow against the wall with a candle, and she traces his profile on the wall. Her father, Butadas, a potter, comes in and sees his profile on the wall and creates a cray relief in his likeness. And I was struck by how this is an origin story of photography, of painting, of drawing. And the need to fix, to make still, to fix one's image came through the obliteration of love. I also performed this work live. I performed it in 2018 at the Broad Museum in Los Angeles. And at that time, I returned back to Ohio for about a year and a half. And while in Los Angeles, before I was about to perform this work at the Broad Museum, the curator of the exhibition said, "These performances tonight are decisively anti-Trump." I said, wow. I kind of like dropped to the floor. I was behind this wall. And afterwards, people walked up to me and said, "You have shown us that the alien is inside all of us." And so I was struck by, remembering acutely me living in Los Angeles for 14 years and border politics, and the border being so much of everyday life, to directly address this notion of foreign on an everyday basis, questions of citizenship, questions of belonging, entangled with the law. Representation, reproduction, presence and absence, and erasure are wrapped in photographs such as Holding Zero, in which black tape binds my entire body. I then present a reproduction of this mummified form with my freed body holding the anonymous replica, breaking free of the image in a fraction of a shutter speed second, breaking free of representation, although be it temporary, artist methodologies of potential. In grid eyes, the figure is absent, yet eyes at the crosshairs of grid lines, vertical and horizontal, appear back at the viewer. The formation of this work, Mirror Woman, addresses the physical and psychological sites of skin, torso, the face, and eyes. Created in spring 2020 at the beginning of our painful COVID-19 pandemic, with each gesture of cutting reflective tape and pressing against my skin, I covered torso and face, including orifices of the auditory, speech, and sight, to conjure contradictions embedded in borders, boundaries between self and other, and potentially national borders. Congruous with the arc of photographs leading up to this work, Mirror Woman refutes portraiture's innate ability to present a legible subject, resisting preconceived notions of identity, such as race and gender, that one may project onto a body. In shutter vision, my jaw holds the shutter release for the camera. So it's a large format film 4x5 negative. Closing my jaw, my teeth bite down to form the image. So I'm holding a shutter release cable in my mouth, and my eyes are completely closed because they're covered with tape. And so when I bite down onto the shutter release, the image is formed. I'm asking, how do we see each other? Is it possible to embrace each other physically, virtually, spiritually, like a photograph, even if for a fleeting moment in time and space? How do we cut through ideological divisions? I'm not going to share much of my steel work, but I also weld with steel. And this work is titled Her Demilitarized Zone. Impressing against looking, long poles press against my eyes, activating the physical and conceptual pressure and pleasure of both looking and being looked at, the frenzy of vision. And these are very recent photograms that I make in the darkroom, without war, without weapon. And last year, it was such a serendipitous full circle. The very first tableau I made in 2005 appeared on the cover of Aperture magazine, curated by Stephanie Tung, with an essay inside by Phoebe Chen, Being and Becoming Asian in America. Thank you.
So I have a few questions, and I wanted to start just by kind of continuing on the conversation about identity and mixedness that emerged throughout your remarks. So maybe this question can ground us as we navigate a larger conversation, and that is a question about race. So could you all speak towards the structure and process of racialization, how you understand it, how your work contributes to our understanding of race, and maybe how your work helps us to push against white supremacist logics of race? We talked about it on the Zoom.
I'll start and give you a partial answer, and
Cool.
y'all fill in the rest. But at the same time we were working on this project, I'm a painter, but so my main, all this academic stuff is just a little side hustle. My main,
That's
I'm a painter. And in my own studio practice, I was exploring my own Okinawan identity and returning back to Hawaii with my dad, who grew up on a sugarcane plantation in Hawaii. So I was interviewing folks in his community and then traveling back and forth to Okinawa and starting to learn about Okinawan history and what that meant. So it was like coming into an identity as an Unshinanshi person, Shimanshi person, and starting to understand what Okinawan indigeneity is, and starting to understand US military bases and all these histories. And for the first time, actually learning about our history in World War II, and most of our family was killed during the Battle of Okinawa. These are things that were just not talked about. I grew up assimilated into whiteness. We're a multiracial family. My mom is Basque and Euro-American. My dad is Okinawan from Hawaii, but we grew up in a predominantly Native American and white Norwegian community, assimilated into sort of whiteness. And so in my own identity journey, I was, you know, we were talking at the time in our book about optional identity, Mary Waters' idea of optional identity.
Mhm.
So this was a choice that I made to learn about my culture and ethnicity. And in that process and journey, I started forming larger and larger communities. And now, you know, in Chicago, I'm friends with lots of other mixed race, queer, non-binary activists, right? And it's awesome and wonderful. But how I got to that space where my life is filled with other folks like that has been a very long journey. So for me, the discussion of race has been one of relationality. And we were talking about, you know, coming into solidarity around issues. So my identity is whatever, but it's like, what do you care about? What are you fighting for? What are you in community with people? And that's for me what's been really relevant.
Thanks.
You know, okay, racialization. No, I think that what really started to interest me, and something that definitely informs War Baby Love Child, is the idea of the history of US wars in Asia. And that's why that war baby image is so strong. It's because we had 100 years of US wars in Asia, and then we forgot about it and pretended it didn't happen. But it was in my own family history, you know, like my dad was a draft doctor. That's why I was born in Australia randomly. My grandfather, my Greek grandfather, served in the all Greek American regiment because there was a racially segregated Greek American regiment. And he served in what was then called Burma, right? You know, so I have these like kind of family members, and then my stepfather, who's a 4th generation Chinese American from San Francisco, Chinatown, is a Vietnam vet. So I have these family histories of US wars in Asia. And then also I was at San Francisco State, I had a wonderful colleague, Helen Toribio, who with her partner Abe Ignacio did this book called The Forgotten War, which is a book of incredible images from popular culture about the US war in the Philippines. And that, like kind of thinking about this contextualization. So for me, racialization as an Asian American is very intimately tied to those histories of war. But then also like being a scholar and a teacher of mixed race studies, and my appointment at San Francisco State in Asian American Studies was specifically with the title Asian Americans of Mixed Heritage. So I do believe that I still haven't heard of anybody having a similar academic appointment where mixed race is part of the job title. But that contextualization also afforded me the opportunity to, you know, to be thinking about how and why do we have a racial hierarchy? What does race mean in this context? You know, in my Lyft drive to the airport in Baltimore, my Lyft driver was Nigerian, and he was asking me, like, what are you doing? Where are you going? And I told him, you know, I was going to this mixed race conference. So he started peppering me with questions. It was just like this. And one of the things that I said to him was that, you know, when we talk about race in the United States and the idea of Blackness, it wasn't always that way. That didn't just like happen. It was constructed on purpose in order to satisfy the institution of slavery. And slavery itself didn't always exist the way that we imagine it today, because, you know, in the 1600s, there were anti-miscegenation laws, which meant that white women were marrying Black men because they saw themselves as being pretty similar, because they were in similar social statuses. Indentured servants and enslaved people could get married and could be free, right? There was a possibility of freedom even at that moment, which is where the name freedom comes from, you know, like, so it doesn't, that idea of what we think of as these racial categories was overtly and deeply constructed, which all of you know, but we forget that it was constructed. And I think it's that process of forgetting that is really important for us to discover and to uncover. And then one last thing I will say is that we completely forget the history of eugenics. We erase it from US history and from our understanding. And so the work that I'm doing now in DEI, one of the things that I really love to do is to support academic disciplines in their process of decolonization and re-examining their own history. So like for biology departments, to start looking at the history of eugenics courses in their own departments and recognizing the extent to which eugenics is deeply embedded. It's so deeply embedded in the teaching of biology that it's still in the basic Mendelian genetics courses, like that kind of instruction is still filtered through Charles Davenport, who was the guy who created the eugenics record office. It's filtered through his understanding of Mendelian genetics. So they did a study recently on people who have understood genetics from that perspective versus those who understand the way human genetics actually works, which is nothing like how P genetics work, right? And those people who've gotten it through via the kind of typical teaching have a more racialized view of human people, right? So we're really baking in racism into the very way that we teach the so-called, universal sciences that are supposedly unbiased. And I think that those things that that's why we need to look at these issues from all of these different perspectives. We also see it baked into policies on data collection. So how the US government requires institutions of education to report their student, staff, and faculty data ends up re-inscribing monoracialism. Even if there's a mixed race category, it's a singular category, right? Versus kind of a check all that apply, be counted across all the category situation. And it is re-inscribing this idea of monoracialism, which is what the racial hierarchy depends upon. And that's why critical mixed race studies is critical, because without it, we can't debunk the racial hierarchy. That's more of a political perspective.
Race and racialization and perspective, perhaps. There's so many entry points to the question. Thank you. Thank you so much for doing. I think I'll try to sum it up through the lens of photography and thinking about the history of photography being in many ways a tool of colonialism to classify, to categorize, to capture, to University of Michigan has the world's largest looking history archive. Zoologist Dean Conant Worcester in the late 1800s, late 1800s, through his photographs and writings, convinced the U.S. government that the Philippines is not governable. Right, and so it was through the lens of photography that racialization was put to use. I think of photography being a device again that flattens real experience into a plane, a surface. I think of photography embedded within all of our psyches. None of us in this room were born prior to the camera. We cannot extract the camera from our consciousness. And so all of us are always in a process of flattening the other. But what do we do to slow that down, right? To take pause, to resist that, and also acknowledging that the camera and the photography is an incredible tool to connect, to create interpersonal bonds, right? And how do we hold that nuance is really important. So race is both a construct, but it's also very real, truly, and it's also a field of connection and solidarity. And so how do we carry that?
I remember when I first came across War Baby Love Child, I had just started grad school, and it really felt like a reassurance that I could pursue a scholarly career on mixed race issues. And I imagine that that's not the case for everyone, for many people in this room. But I also imagine for editors, it must have been something that felt impossible to include everything that you wanted to include within the context of a book. Yeah, so Laura and Wei Ming, say you were to have a second edition of War Baby Love Child. what would you like to include? And then my question for Gina is, how has your work since 2013, since the interview, engaged mixed race studies, mixed race issues? And do you still think about that essay that you cited, the Bradshaw essay titled Beauty and the Beast? So either you can tackle it.
Jan Christopher's Queer and Contemporary Asian American Art.
Mhm.
It answered that question. So at the end of our book, we have an interview with Ken Tanabe, who founded Loving Day, and Stuart Gaffney.
Loving Day, June 12th, which just passed, right?
And Stuart Gaffney, who was really involved in marriage equality movement. And so our book came out in 2013, and Obergefell versus Hodges was 2015. So then I started to think about the heteronormative and homonormative framework in which we had written our book. And I was really starting to think about queerness. Now, mind you, I've always been queer, but I didn't come out publicly as queer until I was 48. I wrote a whole book in the meantime about and so some of the questions that I didn't feel that we answered in our book showed up in the next book. And so it starts out with the surveillance state, and an interview in which we have Hassan Elahi and Wafa Bilal talking about state surveillance and the use of the camera, right? And what is visuality? Wafa Bilal had installed a camera in the back of his head that could surveil him, surveillance, self-surveillance, and uploaded that, right? And Hassan Elahi was very well known for his Cracking Transients project. After 9/11, they thought he was a terrorist. The government thought he was a terrorist and put him on a watch list. Somebody had reported him. So he creates this project where he's telling you all the toilets he's ever used, all the flights he's ever been on, all the tacos he's ever eaten. It's a plethora of data. It tells you everything but nothing at all. And in that book too, we started a foreground now, which we say non-binary, transgender, genderqueer artists. So there was a lot more exploration of gender and sexuality and also in mixed race. So there's a whole center in that book, including contemporary Asian American art that focuses on mixed race. And I interviewed Zave Marta Hurjano, who you write about as well, and Maya McCrindle. So for me, I answered part of that in that second book, because I really feel like we didn't attend enough to Swana and Mena issues. We could have done so much more. Yeah, that was my answer.
So read that book too. Yes.
Feels dated because so much language about LGBTQ.
Edition 2 might be
not 2017. So the conversation is ongoing, but I think what remains the same is the idea of relationality and dialogue, and that these ideas are reflecting lived actual communities at the moment in which we're doing this work. It might become a little bit dated, and then we have the next project, but it's reflecting.
And you're adding to the historical record.
It's not theory coming from some idea imposed on something. It's coming from the artwork, from the artist, from dialogue, in relation, and it's kind of like just capturing a dinner party and saying, here's what it looks like at this moment. Not everyone's included, but we can keep on going. So
yeah, I mean, it's funny because my reaction to that is I don't want to write the next book. I would love you all like to be in dialogue with some piece of War Baby Love Child, or talk about what you love about it, talk about what you hate about it, or just be in conversation with it, and really, like, what does it make you think of doing? What does it make you want to do? I do want to go back to that last chapter with Ken Tanabe and Stuart Gaffney, because I think it's quite important. So we included this because they're both artists. We put them in conversation with one another because we thought
at CMRS.
At CMRS.
At CMRS in 2010.
Yeah, and we did that because we wanted them to reflect on this kind of sharedness, like kind of coming at like marriage equality from two different perspectives, right? So Ken Tanabe was he's a graphic designer, and he created the Loving Day symbol for like an art class that he was enrolled in. And then he was like, that's a symbol for something. Let's make the something. And that something is the Loving Day movement, which is a movement to get June 12th celebrated as a national holiday in remembrance of the landmark case Loving versus Virginia, which was decided on June 12th, right? So that's what that is. But because the marriage equality movement used Loving versus Virginia as the legal precedent for queer marriage equality, right? That's why these things are interconnected. Stuart Gaffney is primarily a filmmaker. He kind of identifies as a queer Eurasian filmmaker, but around that time period, he and his husband, John, became literally the poster boys for the marriage equality movement. Like in San Francisco, everywhere I went, I was seeing Stuart and John's face, like on, bus shelters and whatever, billboards and everything, as the representative of the marriage equality movement. And so that I thought was a pretty interesting, juxtaposition, and having those two in dialogue helped us kind of set up, like, it was like the lily pad for the making sure that the queerness was in critical mixed race studies. And that is something that we hope keeps getting reintroduced. It can't be reintroduced enough, right? And I guess now I'm really also interested in neurodiversity and disabilities and how those things interact with our mixedness. There is, well, and okay, I'm just going to tell you what I've been thinking this whole time. I want to write a book called All the Colors Purple, and it's my main favorite color. Color is all of us to do that, but we're like, the reason that I want to do that is, to me, purple it's a liminal color. It's an in-between color. But when you think of the liminal, it feels like a narrow space, like the space of a doorway between two rooms. But for me, purple represents the liminal as expansive, as open, as available to everybody, because there is a shade of purple to suit everyone's skin tone. There is a shade of purple to suit, and Laura's like, you're never going to get me anywhere with colors. So there is a shade of purple that resonates for every kind of mood or feeling, because you can go almost all the way white and still be in the purple, almost all the way black and still be in the purple, almost all the way red, almost all the way blue, and you still have this purple playground. So I know you're. What are you being a lavender menace?
I see. Yes.
Got purple in your hair. You know that it's in there. So like, like for next steps, right? I actually would love to do something that is my own art, because for many decades I have done things to create and support and uplift other people's art, and I mostly have much time for my own. So that's the real. Yeah.
Okay, Anna, you were asking about in the War Baby Love Child, there's incredible collection of artisan views, and I quoted an essay by Carla K. Bradshaw. It's in Maria Tipi's book, Racially Mixed People in America, which and it was first just becoming an artist. I was a staff member at the California College of the Arts, artist Emily Carlin asked us all to contribute an essay for a graduate reader. I wasn't studying graduate school, a staff member sitting in the class, and I chose this essay, Beauty and the Beast by Carla K. Bradshaw. And in it, Carla K. Bradshaw talks about camouflage, passing and not passing simultaneously. And so for, like, I'm with my Filipino family, I'm passing but not passing Filipino. I'm with my American family, passing, not passing. And I read that essay, and it was more of a sociology text, but for me it read as artist strategy, and I really just ran with it from there. Now I'm thinking just more about art pedagogy, teaching my students, and Elise and Sam, who are here from the Department of Art. Okay, thank you. Thank you. And for you, what does it mean to identify mixed race? I know it's difficult when there isn't another professor like me who has that maybe in their wheelhouse, or acknowledges the field of mixed race, right?
And kind of building on what Gina is saying, it'd be kind of cool to just revisit all the artists and see what impact the book had for them, and where they are now, and how they're Are they still exploring some of those same questions? And if they are, what does it look like now?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I have so many questions, but I wanted to turn it over to audience. You're welcome to project your question. If you wanted to raise your hand, I can try to point in your direction. You're also encouraged to go into the app and type in questions in the Q&A, which I don't see any at this moment. Any questions emerging? Yes, Ajay. I don't think it's, oh, it is.
Many courses.
Hello, my name's MJ Jones. I use they them pronouns. I'm trying to articulate the question. It's for you, Gina. Also being a Filipino and half Black. I noticed in your photographs, which were very lovely, you covering up your body. And I'm thinking about when I go to the Philippines and how like whitening our body, like in Asia, like my mom buys a lot of whitening products to make her body look better, look prettier, whatever, like closer to whiteness. So I'm wondering that kind of that centric of you covering your body and that camouflage to hide your body, and then maybe your own kind of sense of understanding or how you navigate maybe being in the Philippines and the body and hiding the body, lightening the body. I'm wondering if there's kind of like this a conflict or the middle ground of like how Filipinos in the Philippines navigate their body, and then you exploring your identity here by covering up the body and the camouflage.
The Philippines is, I'm not as a whole, but especially in products, right? And there's such an emphasis on lightening the skin. That there's so many skin whitening creams sold over the counter. And right, the historical legacies of colonial legacies of Spain, the United States are still present, even I think with the covering, there is a heightening, even though there's like any richer, there is a heightened awareness of skin. And I wanted to emphasize skin as a site of imaging, imaging each other, skin as a type of photography. Thank you.
Can I do a teacher thing? And I would point folks to two books. So one is a book called Is Lighter Better? It's about skin colorism in Asian American communities. It was done by Joanne Rondia and Paul Spicker. It's a fascinating study. It's really reveals a lot about Asian American attitudes around skin colorism. And then the other text, since we keep talking about Venn diagrams, I have to mention this wonderful book from the early 90s called Intersecting Circles, The Voices of Hapa Women in Poetry and Prose, which is focused on mixed race Asian American and I think there are some Native Hawaiian women in Hawaii who are poets and creative writers. So, you know, if you want to go old school, that's a really great text for folks.
Thank you. Yes, feel free to come up.
Hiya. My name is Rihanna. I've come from the UK, from Loughborough University, and I'm a PhD. And I'm very early in my career, and I'm trying to incorporate the study of mixed race studies in the UK. Is that's typically not something that we consider a field of study, or kind of its own legitimate field in its own right. So I was wondering kind of what you might advise for an early career researcher trying to bring this kind of field of study into our legitimate fields of study, I guess, and how we can go about moving that field forward and where you sort of see it going. And if anyone has a postdoc going, I'm also looking.
Critical Mixed Race Studies Conference is for the exact same purpose. We were out there doing this work, but we were in Asian American studies or in art, and not being legitimized in doing the work. And I literally, before CMRS, there was a conference that was organized annually in the Ivy Leagues by the mixed race student organizations in the Ivy League schools, right? And it was at Cornell one year, and then one year it was at Harvard. And I remember I came back from the Harvard conference, and my dean asked me like, "Oh, how was your weekend? You were at a conference at Harvard, right?" And I said, "Yeah, as a matter of fact, I was the keynote speaker." They hadn't told me beforehand because it was organized by students, so I just showed up. So I'm like, my dean, you know, yeah, I was a big surprise. It turned out I was the keynote speaker, and he said, "Well, that conference was organized by students, right?" And I was like, "Yeah," and he said, "It doesn't count for shit." And that was in my spark to that eventually grew into this conference, right? And unfortunately, the side effect of that is that when we organized the conference, we were thinking a lot about academic legitimacy. Now, granted, we also, because of our community arts organizing background, we also made sure that arts were always represented. Laura can tell you about the inclusion of the not mixed groups, but yeah, Thatcher Cox and Shepherd Coniff. We have to give them a lot of credit for helping bring on. I think the first iteration I tried to work with folks, volunteer, do things. I'm a painter, I create shows, but there's a big difference between that and running a film festival and putting on performances. So to have people who came from theater backgrounds, to have all those skill sets, it was incredible, really transformative. Yeah, and then we also always had folks. I want to really make sure that everybody knows this. There have been community organizations often created by like mixed race communities themselves that have been doing the work of preserving the history, of collecting oral histories, of collecting documents, and of telling the stories of their identities and their communities that otherwise might just be completely lost. But they weren't connecting with academics, right? So one of the things that we were really happy to do and proud of this conference doing that's different from most other even ethnic studies academic conferences is making sure that those community organizations have
And
space.
students too.
And students.
Yeah. So I'm going to answer your question. So you may never find that you'll have mixed race
Yeah,
studies or
department.
yeah. You know, whatever languages in your institution or where your field is, you can say, I'm doing community engaged scholarship. I'm working with mixed methodology. I'm working intersectionally, interdependent, interdisciplinary. So there's language that comes from your field that you can use as a framing device for your methodology. And maybe it just happens that your research subject is this. So I think there's a way to translate that within whatever our disciplines are, if that makes sense. And the other thing is, we have our home where you're employed, but to think about the through line of your mission in your life, and that may or may not include the academy. And increasingly, I'm not so happy with the academy. So there's things that you have to look sort of more broadly and being rooted in communities and accountable to communities. We're not just by ourselves doing this work. So what are the needs that you're serving? And I think then you can translate that into whatever you need to do.
Yeah, I mean, that also goes back to the history of ethnic studies, right? Like, you know, so I was at SF State where ethnic studies was founded by a 5-month student shutdown of the campus. Still today, the longest running strike in US higher education history. And I was lucky enough to work alongside people who had literally put themselves in the face of police with guns and big horses, because they had horses on campus. And also who had allowed themselves to be in jail. One of my colleagues was in jail for 21 days. She was a nice Chinese girl from Chinatown, is what she used to tell me. And she didn't know how exactly, but she got involved in this movement. And she did it because she wanted to make sure that we had a relevant education. So when I think about those founders and those people that I rubbed elbows with in the hallways at SF State, and everybody in that college was, you know, when it started, they either became the faculty, or people say the women became the staff in the office, and the men become faculty, with a few, like one exception of a woman who became a faculty member. You know, sexism aside, they were willing to really push the boundaries in order to create the space they needed for themselves and for us. So that became my answer. and why I thought it was so critical for critical mixed race studies as the conference, with always the goal that the conference would create enough of a mass to then launch the association. And if you're not a member of the association, please, join, because the whole purpose of it was to make sure that we would have that space. And it is my dream that it will become an international movement. And I totally expect you, Brianna, to found it in the UK. But I kind of think you will, because you have that leadership quality.
We might have time for one more question, maybe two.
While you're thinking of those, I did want to just sort of plug
Yeah.
some amazing things some of the artists from our book are doing. So Gina is not the only Guggenheim awardee from our book. Makita Ahuja got who's the cover artist. Yeah, got a Guggenheim in 2018. Two artists that I just think have done such amazing work. Deborah Yekop-Pappen, who you interviewed. And she also has purple hair. He co-founded the Center for Native Futures in Chicago. Look that up. They are doing incredible work. Louis Gong, who I went with to the Maiden Foundation group early for the leadership retreat way back when we all met in 2008. He went on to found a company called 8th Generation. So early in the back of the day, he was, hand painting sneakers, and then it became this giant, amazing company that he ran 8th Generation. And then he sold that and got to retire, and now he's working on for.
And if you don't know 8th Generation, their tagline is inspired natives, not native inspired. So please look them up. They do really amazing work.
Yeah, it's just been incredible to watch over the years where the artists went and what they're doing. And,
there's a lot of I guess like if there was a second book, like I said, it would be really interesting to see what the artists are doing. So you all go out and do that research, interview those artists and find out like where they are now. There was one artist who kind of represented the older generation. I think she might even have been the first artist I interviewed, Leland, and she was a contact that Mark Johnson made for us. Leland had been a really well-known fine artist. She wouldn't tell us how old she is, I don't know. But she was friends with Isamu Noguchi, and her father Yangi is a very famous artist as well. Yeah, and it was her friendship with Isamu Noguchi that really kind of captured my imagination, because it was based on the fact Isamu Noguchi was her father's generation. So, but when she met him, he immediately said to her, "Oh, you're mixed like me." And that became like the spark that united their friendship. And to me, that's like it reflected the friendship that Laura and I have. If you can't tell, we look a lot alike, and sometimes people will like mistake us for each other. Sometimes I look at her and mistake her for myself. I don't know. Since they were little twin stars. Anyway, nothing to do with this. But I think we forget that friendship is so important, but it has been absolutely everything for my career, right? Like it's the only reason that I survived academia is deep friendship and co-mentoring and supporting each other and making a conscious decision as soon as you get the littlest bit of power to be pulling and supporting others, with you and uplifting them and just making room for everybody to succeed. Because the myth of academia, there's a couple myths. One is that it's a meritocracy. It is not. So if you don't succeed in academia, I want to remind you that it's academia that failed you, not the other way around. And the second thing is that it's a star system. There can only be one star of each discipline. Okay, this is not Highlander. You do not only have a star head. Sorry, that was a too old reference. Cultural reference. Look it up. Okay. But it is actually possible for us all to succeed. There is enough pie to go around. You just need to keep baking more pie. So let's do that.
one more person to plug, Stephen Murphy Shigematsu, who's in our book. I don't see, but in terms of scholars that came before us, so that was really important to include. Project.
Yeah.
Well, let's give a warm thank you to our panelists. Thank you.